But that made a big effect on me, and I really wanted to learn to throw. I was slightly rubbish at learning some of the other processes and techniques.
You were biased.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Artfully Crafted. My name is Alienor, and each week I travel to a craftsperson's studio, interview them and show you their work. Please help this channel by hitting the subscribe button. This week we're going to Selborne to meet ceramicist Nicholas Lees. A few weeks ago he took part in Collect Art Fair at Somerset House with Cavaliero Fin Gallery. I first came across Nick's work through Future Heritage at the Design Centre in Chelsea Harbour, which is curated by Corinne Julius. His work kind of stopped me in my tracks because it looked like it was literally shape-shifting as I was walking across the exhibition. You'll understand why in a minute. Hi Nick.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me. We're here in your studio and gallery in Selborne. And you mentioned you've had this space for how long? For about?
I think 7 years, 6 since I was properly in here. Yeah. And prior to that I had a studio on a farm up the road from here, 5 miles up the road.
So you've been sort of in and around this area for
I've lived here for nearly 20 years, or pretty much 20 years. And this space is much closer to where I live and became available, so it's a nice short walk from here to home, which is delightful.
That's great. And we've got some example of your work, of different phases of your work. Could you start by telling us a little bit about what you make and how you make it, and maybe focusing on your more recent work, I guess?
Yeah, well, so the things that I'm most known for at the moment are the body of thrown and lathe turned porcelain, which this is an example of, that I've been making for about the last 10 or 12 years. But what we've got on the table in front of us sort of represents 4 different little representatives from 4 different bodies of work over the last 33 years nearly that I've been working in ceramics. And there's, broadly speaking, you know, about every 10 years I seem to have a change. And so this chronologically reads from this piece to this being the latest. They look quite distinct, but increasingly I see over time and reflection, I've come to see the kind of underlying threads that run through them. And that actually informs me and helps me develop new work. And I mean, the key underlying thread is a relationship between making and thinking, and between sort of how things are made and why things are made, that are very, very intrinsically linked for me.
Yeah, you said that to me, that you feel like for you it's very important for skill versus concept, and for you concept comes first, is that right? Or is more important perhaps?
Yes, I suppose I don't want the work to just be about skill. How things are made and skillful making is really interesting to me, and kind of important to me, and I like to become good at doing things. But I don't want that to be what the work rests on, kind of conceptually or visually. So I can't really sort of separate them out. So it's not that I have an idea or that the concept of the piece is more important.
But it has to be there, basically.
But it has to be there. So the work, my motivation for working for making is probably conceptually driven. You know, I'm trying to make things that represent or are like a physical manifestation of ideas and emotions and experiences as well. Places I've been and places I've looked at are very important as well.
So could you talk us through the concepts behind each of these pieces? that we have in front of us?
Yeah, right, okay. So this was in my degree show from Bristol Polytechnic in 1992, and as a small porcelain jug. When I went to art college in Bristol to study ceramics, I was taught to throw by Wally Keeler, which was an amazing experience because he's an absolutely amazing thrower. And we had lots of other great tutors as well, but that made a big effect on me. And I really wanted to learn to throw. I was slightly rubbish at learning some of the other processes and techniques.
You were biased.
Yeah. I suppose the distinct thing about this is that I've never, even when I was throwing pots, I very seldom threw a pot and took it off the wheel and it was finished. I've always wanted to do more to it. So this is, got quite a lot of stages of construction. It's actually the thrown pot is here. It's kind of an egg shape.
I was wondering about that, yeah.
Then it's turned to this egg shape, then cut off at an angle, a slab placed on, an extruded handle, a slab spout, and then cut to fit.
Right.
So there's a few things in that. One, that I've always engaged with quite complicated processes and probably made life a bit too complicated for myself. And I was spending, making a very, very long-winded way to make a small jug. Another thing is, particularly this facet here, is the relationship between kind of plane and form, and between curve and plane. So seeing a form, this kind of complete egg form, and wanting to slice through it and make the handle be part of it. So there was a kind of thinking about form, rather that the handle was an integral part of the form rather than an attachment. So I suppose there was a kind of formal thinking there of visually composing things. So that has that sense of a sort of relationship, as I say, between plane and solid, and between curve and angle. That some of those things, and also the way the hand fits inside the form, I quite liked as well. There was a series of bowls as well, where I did the rim made the handle. There were sort of big handle bowls where there's a cut out space for the hand to go in. So it's sort of thinking about how these things were composed, and those formal elements are quite important.
Sorry, you mentioned to me that you were taught drawing as part of, was that at that stage?
Not really. I mean, I think, we.
So you
we
weren't
sort of
necessarily
sketching
this.
I would do a bit. I would sort of sketch things like profile, and that was actually one of the things that slightly illustrated to me the limitations of drawing before making something, because drawing is this two-dimensional activity and making is a three-dimensional activity. So if I was drawing this, I would always draw it in profile like that, and I'd never really know what it looked like from this angle until I'd made it.
Yeah.
And it needs to be satisfactory from all these angles, and the whole thing is experienced in the round.
Yeah.
So drawing is useful as a way of thinking through relationships of proportion. Should this spout be this big? But it's actually, or how does the handle, how does this curve work? How does it sit on something? But those things are also more, because I can think quite clearly I can imagine things in 3 dimensions quite clearly. So to that extent, at that stage, I found it quite trying to have a sort of being asked, show us your sketchbook all of the time, because I just wanted to, I could just make something and the drawing felt like it got in the way.
Fair. And so then you said you move on to, what happened in between those two pieces then? So
after my BA, I spent 4 years working in a studio in Bristol, partly making my own work and working part-time for another potter who was a slipcaster, made a guy called Anthony Theakston, who makes a range of bird forms, largely now in bronze actually, but still some ceramics. And at that time they were all jugs. They were sort of nominally useful, but I don't think anyone really used them. But because they were slipcast, someone else could make them for him. And so he was being very successful and he needed some assistance. So that was great for me because he had a studio in the same building, so it was fantastic. I had a sort of part-time job in one room and my own studio in another room. And he was a really good mentor actually. He taught me an awful lot, and particularly of sort of thinking about form and developing form and a different way of working. And partly because of that I'd spent all my time throwing, and then I was starting to feel like the wheel was a limitation, and that everything that I threw on the wheel, I ended up making it look like it wasn't made on a wheel by some very complicated means. So I thought, well, is this, so then that rather than a liberation, that process started to feel like a straitjacket. And so, and I knew that I wanted to sort of explore further the relationship between the process, how I was making something and what I was making. And that I was sort of I was getting a bit more traction with the work, and it was going to some sort of craft galleries, and I was doing some fairs and things with it, and it was kind of okay, and some of it would sell all right, but I could see the kind of limitations of it.
Yeah.
And that I wanted to reinvent the way I was thinking. And I went to do a 1-year master's in Cardiff. And I was sort of expecting to do that and come out with something that was actually much more like Tony. It was much more of a sort of slightly design prospect, maybe producible on a bigger scale. I went completely the other way and started making this kind of obscure abstract sculpture, of which this is a sort of small example. The kind of thread of thought goes, I'd been looking at armour, medieval plate armour, as an inspiration for these kind of thrown, cut and altered vessels.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking about exoskeletons on beetles and so on. And then that got me thinking about the relationship between a sort of man-made artificial form and an organic natural form. So it got me thinking about that kind of dichotomy, which is a very, very fundamental thing that quite a lot of artists think about, between something that's artificial, natural, organic, mechanical. You can see it, you can frame that in lots of different ways. Which got me thinking about how things are made. And in ceramics, there's a lot of organic visual reference in ceramics. Lots of people are inspired by natural forms in making ceramics. And I had this little idea that partly that is because when you're making ceramics, a lot of it appears to grow in front of you. So when you throw a pot or when you coil a pot, this thing literally grows in front of you. And so it feels very, and it's earth as well. So it feels very of the natural world.
Yeah. And a lot of potters, I think, talk about clay as if it was almost a living being, as if it was like a partner.
We put a lot of potters talk about their sort of interaction with the material. I've got lots of things to say about the interaction with the material, but I mean, I'm not so sure about it because it's very amorphous clay. I mean, one of the things about clay is, it's a bag of clay. It's sort of something and nothing, and it's very few potters that take a piece of clay out of a bag or dig it out of the ground and use nothing but their hands to make the pot. The total sort of formlessness of the material, and its potential to take on all sorts of different forms and to imitate all sorts of other materials is part of its richness. But its sort of formlessness is why processes become so important and why people get really hooked on throwing or coiling, and they get hooked on particular tools. Tools are very important to ceramic potters. So we have this kind of interface between us and the material that is something I think about quite a lot, about where machines and tools and hand tools and all those sort of things help us relate to, and deal with the kind of interface between us, our hands, our minds, and this stuff. So I was thinking about that, how things start to grow, and then I was thinking, because I've been working for a slip caster, which is really an industrial process, and mould making is a process of containment and works from the outside in. So it's not a process of growth and expansion; it's a process of containment. So it felt like it came from the other side of that dichotomy. So I basically set out to make work that explored that notion of the relationship between these things, and just carving forms in plaster, thinking, is it possible by this reductive process to make something that appears to be swelling and growing, to carve back to a curve? And then what do I do with that? And because I'm interested in the processes, so then what eventually I did is I actually was carving those forms. So the space in here is what's made by a carved piece of plaster. And this is slip cast, but it's the inversion of slip casting. So basically, by flipping the process on its head, I was able to surprise myself. There's another that surprise is a really important thing, actually. sort of subverting control. That what I was just talking about the interaction between maker. There's a sort of power balance going on. There's how much control we've got or not. It's a very interesting thing, and people, and I think about this, and lots of people talk about not being too in control. And maybe there was a feeling that I'd got too in control of this, and I was throwing things, but taking all of taking all of that.
You wanted to sort
the
of
evidence
give
of the
back
process
some of
out
the control.
I was carving a plaster form, thinking about what I was saying earlier about that swelling form and reductive process to swelling form, immersing that in slip, so casting a layer of slip onto the outside of it, which is this white layer here, and then building further onto that with other stuff, which is casting slip mixed with all sorts of aggregates and colours and colouring agents and so on, which is a sort of gloopy mess and impossible to control. So it was a subversion of my own control as well.
Kind of the opposite
of that.
Yeah. It's funny because
so
it has
this,
looks
there's
like
almost
fossils
in a way. I did an exhibition called Future Fossil.
Okay,
because
cool.
someone said to me, I showed him a photograph of a piece like this. I mean, this one's a bit unfinished and rough. And he said, it looks like a piece of wreckage from an alien spaceship. And I just thought, that's actually perfect. Yes. So it has got that sort of, And that H.R. Geiger's, designs for Alien are really interesting as well. So that, you're talking about kind of futuristic, high-tech future, but you've got this very organic kind of alien notion with an interaction with a space machine. So that's, part of what was going on there. Going back to that thing of control, one of the things that's happening here and the subversion of control is that this evolved into a body of work, which is some quite big sculpture and pieces of plaster that would take me a week to carve, a very precise finish, but they only appear as a void in the final object. So all that kind of careful, high-skilled craft work just ends up appearing as a negative space. So there's a thing going on here about positive and negative space, and there's also a thing going on about cross-section and solid, which relates back to that. I didn't see the connection at the time. So that relationship between plane and solid, and that element of surprising myself is, particularly when I started out with these, I was just making a plaster form, not knowing what the ceramic piece I was going to make from it was. And then I was making these ceramic interventions, a sort of cross-sectional analyses of those objects, and then you do this thing and you build this around it, and then you cut this away and you go, wow, look at that, that's the cross-section through that. So there was something about that, surprising myself in that as well. It is quite interesting, the sort of potentially useful, or capable of holding water, or about holding space, to sort of abstract sculpture, which became more so back to pottery. I mean, these pieces you see, they're very much pottery process, and they're very rooted, in fact, in some elements of pottery history. So that use of throwing and lathe turning, I knew that that's something that had gone on for a long time, but it's sculpture. I mean, for one, it's actually a tube, so it doesn't hold water.
Oh, they're tubes.
So, I mean, some of the things would hold water, but these don't, which is partly just for technical reasons. In how I make it, makes it much easier to make it.
Oh, yes, of course.
It's about how it goes on the lathe.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense.
And
they're so heavy.
They're heavier than they look, aren't they?
Yeah. I wasn't expecting that.
No. When I first, there's an awful lot to say about these, but I've been aware of the relationship to pottery and to vessels very much with this. And I think there is still a relationship with vessels from here, in that these are still thinking about positive and negative space. And so they're thinking about articulating space. And, any pot, whether it's a cup, a mug, a vase, or a piece of artwork in the form of a pot, and there's always, for the history of pottery, that's been a kind of nebulous boundary. There's not been a very clear, distinct boundary between this is a useful pot and that's a decorative or artistic pot.
Yeah, it's a sort of sliding scale, isn't it?
It's a sliding scale. So there've always been things, maybe not when the very earliest pots were probably purely made for function, but it still had, I think from very, very early on. I'm not a good enough ceramic historian to really be sure about this, but it seems to me that when you look at things in museums, there's, people embellish things from the beginning. Anyway, that's a digression, possibly.
No, but I get what you mean. I think, there's a point at which function is very important, and then it's function first, embellishment second.
So it's where,
and then there's a point at which, it's, when you think about like medieval, for example, like pottery and things like that, it becomes presentation pieces. It doesn't necessarily, the very finest craftsmanship ends up being showpieces as opposed to just function. So there is, and you're right, I don't actually know at what point that starts to happen.
But what I was leading into thinking about is effectively that any pot, whether it's functional or not, if it's a hollow, ceramics always tends to deal with hollowness. I mean, here I'm not dealing with hollowness, so maybe that's a proper digression from that. But it's about the containment of space. So as soon as you make a pot, you might be making a mug, but in a kind of conceptual level, if you want to conceptualize a mug, you're going, this bit of space in here is a separate bit of space from the rest of the world, and I've wrapped it in clay. And the defining points of that are the rim and the foot. So the rim of any pot, and you talk to any potter, they're probably, particularly throwers, but almost any potter, obsessed with the rims and how the edge finishes, because it's the boundary between the space contained by this thing and the rest of the world. It's the defining boundary of the object, and the other defining boundary is how it deals with gravity and how it sits on a surface. So when you're learning to throw and when you're teaching throwing or making pots, foot and rim is like what it's all about, because it's about a containment of space. Now, when I started to make these pieces, the original inspiration for them was a research project. I went to do a research project at the Royal College of Art as not particularly because I wanted a qualification. I was, I didn't go as far as a PhD because I just wasn't interested in being called doctor. I was interested in a very, very focused context to make a new body of work. And it was part of a sort of shift from spending most of my time teaching to wanting to kind of reboot my making career. Or re-energize it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes it's good to have some time to look sort of inwards and think, what am I...
It was amazing. God, it was the best thing I ever did, actually. I mean, I was very lucky to have the opportunity, but to return to education when you've been working in a subject and probably I've been teaching in an art college for 10, 12 years, was an incredible opportunity and very, very enriching. But there's actually a very direct link between these things. When I started that research project, I just started experimenting with some things about digital CAD design and rapid prototyping forms as a way of trying to find a strategy for making new forms. And I thought the project was going to be about this relationship between the digital and the analog in making. About 3 weeks in, it became clear that actually that wasn't really the question that interested me, and what really interested me was the transition from 2 to 3 dimensions, and that because digital making tends to happen in slices quite a lot. It's one of the ways that things are made, but it's also, and in CAD you can go from a line to a form by drawing it and extruding it through virtual space. So I actually became interested in this kind of transition from, this did make me think about these pieces and reflect on them in different ways. The transition between line and form, between 2 and 3 dimensions. And that got me looking at and thinking about cast shadows and silhouettes. And so I got to thinking about that relationship between something and its shadow as being very interesting in thinking about the relationship between 2 and 3 dimensions in objects, because the three-dimensional object casts a two-dimensional shadow on a surface. But also that sense of us extruding things. Extruding is a wonderful way of making things in clay, but actually that notion that the light was a bit like an extrusion.
Yeah, but it's funny because you're talking there, you're thinking about the shape and how things are going to fit together. There you said you were thinking about the negative space, and then now you're thinking about shadow. It's like every time you think of a new angle to think about your pieces, and you're sort of...
So I suppose it's what, in a sense they are kind of, I'm driven by the ideas behind the things and then finding ways to kind of manifest those ideas and make them into things. What came to interest me about the shadows was that sense of form, but really these qualities of light and the ephemerality of light, and particularly the blurred edges, because I was making the same forms in the real world as in the digital world, and all the digital ones were just so either there or not. And as soon as you make it, just even try and make it in clay, it's got imperfections, and the edge is not as precise as you think. And looking at shadows, I just got really interested in the penumbra, the half shadow. So when I started making these, I've been doing all these experiments, trying to find ways to make clay be half there. And I had these things, I was doing all sorts of bits, adding combustibles to make it sort of half it burn away, and adding more and more different, doing sort of blends of different materials, making some very thick pots and blocks of porcelain, which I was just drilling lots of holes in until they disintegrated on a pillar drill, which is like, bad. And, I had these things which I'd thrown very thick in order to drill lots of holes in them. And then I suddenly thought, well, actually, when I used to make proper pots, and particularly, I love making bowls. And, when you throw a bowl, you can make the inside of it perfect on the wheel, but you can't make the bit attached to the wheel. So you always leave it for a day or two and trim or turn off the base. And that's a magnificent transition. One of the other amazing things about clay is this kind of, and thinking about the interaction of making, is that you move from something that is liquid to it's plastic, and that plastic is a whole range of how soft it is, to what we call leather hard, where it stops being a plastic material and becomes a resistant material. And that's a very, very interesting shift. I always quite liked it. So I quite like the resistant, that transition. So basically, the long and the short of it is I actually sort of enjoyed turning a foot ring slightly more than I did throwing a bowl. And I thought, turning, that's how you make clay be half there. That's how you remove clay. So I just did that, had this one thing, and I just turned all these fins into it. And initially thought, well, that's quite interesting, but it's a bit too simple. And then over time of looking at that and some other ones I did, I started to realise that there was really quite a lot going on in that. And I'm still using that process 12 years later, and finding it rewarding and interesting and surprising still, actually.
That's great.
So essentially, and I also knew that there was a kind of pottery reference there, as I was saying, that people have been throwing and turning for years, and throwing as a, Wedgwood have been doing that, and there's an amazing engine turning lathes in the Wedgwood factory still, and so on.
So you're sort of writing yourself in that narrative of
so I was
history
thinking,
of design.
just because I've been looking at and thinking about ceramics and visiting factories and museums for a long time, I immediately got that kind of effect that I was tapping into part of the sort of history of the material.
Innovating.
And there's also a reference to electrical insulators, and some of those are turned porcelain that you get on pylons. Those are actually, there used to be a company in Stoke called Allied Insulators who made those, and part of what they did was by turning it. So there's masses that I've come to understand about that. When I first, but also going back to the pottery thing, when I first started making these, they were all cylinders and cones. And consciously trying not to look too much like pots. So engaging with this pottery process, but saying this is sculpture, because I'm not trying to make pots. I'm trying to deal with something that is visual and conceptual. But my world is the world of ceramics, and so it's kind of embracing with pots. And going back to that thing about space and containing space, it was really interesting to me because I was actually dealing with the kind of that blurred edge of a shadow when you translate it into the pot becomes the kind of an indefinite like hinterland of or boundary between space contained and space occupied. So there's a what space does the thing occupy and what does it contain? And so it's just thinking about the boundaries of that in a different way. So I was making these cylinders and cones, and over time I've increasingly embraced things which look more overtly like a vase or a pot. But there's also something that's, with these pieces that's been pointed out to me is, because it's such a familiar form, I'm taking the familiar and making it unfamiliar by what I'm doing to it. It makes it kind of strange and otherworldly because you can't quite fix it. You know, as you move around this object, it shifts, and it's not a fixed thing in your mind. So I've sort of come to embrace, ceramics more, and then these more recent flux works are.
How long have you been making those?
Well, very slowly over quite a long period of time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, the first tests of these actually originate from when I was doing the research project that, and they've taken a long time to sort of come out into the world. And so I've slowly been doing experiments every now and then, and they're starting to find more form now. I mean, there's some other, behind us, there's some other recent sort of manifestations of that idea.
Yeah.
And they're about an interaction of control. They're about an interaction between two material qualities. So essentially I'm taking one piece which I'm carving out of porcelain and making it interact in the kiln with another thing that was just as precise as this when it went into the kiln. So this is porcelain and this is porcelain with flux. And one melts a bit and the other doesn't.
Yes.
So you get this kind of interaction between materials. And it's a bit like the interaction that's happening here between form and space.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of continuum there. But they are, as you say, totally a move away from. They're still thinking about space. Any sculpture is thinking about space and how you articulate a bit of space. But they have moved away from the kind of overt pottery reference.
Yeah.
Whilst, on one level I've been embracing that more, at the same time I've moved away from it.
Yeah. No, thank you for taking us through that. It's really nice to understand the chronology and, the different things of, because it's a response to things. It's you learning, it's you responding to, as you say, the history of ceramics, it's you innovating with materials. So it's really great to kind of understand more how that intersects together. I'm curious about when your first foray into ceramics was and sort of how you first got into it.
I think, I was at a boarding school and I had a very, very big and kind of dynamic art department. And I did O-level art as a choice. I wasn't very good at it, I got a C. but I did do. I think I quite like the three-dimensional. I like the sense of making stuff.
I find it so strange that you're saying, I got a C in an O-level art, and yet here we are.
I know, here we are. So then I chose to do art A-level as a fourth A-level, and sort of out of the normal timetable schedule. Not because I thought I was only good at art. There was lots of people who were much better than me.
Right.
And there were a lot of people, it was 50 people in my year doing A-level art, so it was quite a lot. And I just sort of quite I didn't think I was very good at it, and I didn't think, it was just something I quite liked doing, so I just did it as an extra. But whilst I was doing my, whilst I was in the sixth form, and quite late on, in the second year of my sixth form actually, a new teacher arrived at the school who, to teach pottery in the art department, and he did raku firing with us, which is massively appealing to sort of teenage pyromaniacs, and very, very engaging and interactive and sort of immediate and exciting, and he also showed me
because there's that cross section between art and science, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, that's quite exciting.
Yeah, and science is a bigger and bigger part of what I do now, actually. But he also showed me Hans Koper's work, which I fell in love with. And and also, gave the notion that ceramics was a thing one could do. I mean, even it hadn't occurred to me before that's actually a thing you can go and study at a higher level than doing it as a sort of add-on to your schoolwork kind of thing.
Well, yeah, no, but, fair enough. Most people wouldn't. There's so many different fields of art that people don't realise that you can study.
So that's when I first got interested in it, and I took a sort of circuitous route where, at the point where that occurred to me, I already had a place to study English and history at university, which I always wanted to do, and my sort of slightly, my very kind parents said, why don't you go and do that proper degree first, and if you still want to go to art school afterwards, we'll help support you through that. And they were true to their word, and so I did a BA in English and history followed by a BA in ceramics.
Yeah, it's funny, I had that conversation with my father and my stepmom recently, where they sort of said to me, but aren't you glad that you got an academic degree first? Has it not been helpful in some way? You kind of get the sense that they're almost feeling guilty for having, had that influence. But
no, it's been a very good. I mean, I didn't work very hard on that degree, it has to be said. I had a lot of fun. I've got some very good friends from then, but it has overall been an interesting thing to me to have. At some point, it's difficult to have done this kind of academic study before going to art college, and I was saying that sort of shift from analysis to synthesis was quite took a bit of getting my head around, and I found difficult to feel the freedom to make things without sort of overthinking them, because I'd been.
I guess that's kind of what you said a little bit about this, right? Yeah.
Because I'd been trained in thinking about things which are already made, so.
But you mentioned to me that you also wrote for Ceramics Review, right? Which you probably wouldn't have had the confidence to do that if you hadn't had that degree.
So it gave me a kind of a slightly unusual position, not exclusively unusual, but Emmanuel Cooper, who was at that time the editor of Ceramic Review, was became a good friend and was immensely supportive and was interested in the fact that of that slightly unusual route into ceramics, and so he started asking me to write reviews and sort of profiles of artists and a couple of sort of broader sort of thematic articles for Ceramic Review. So a few years I wrote quite a lot for Ceramic Review, which was helpful in kind of building a kind of profile and getting my name around.
Do you think that was also helpful because you have mentioned the history of ceramics, had you already got a good grasp of that before, or did writing those articles also help in getting to know the landscape?
Writing this article wasn't really about the history of ceramics. I mean, my knowledge of the history of ceramics has just sort of developed over years of studying, but also through teaching, actually. So I think the other thing about that combination of educational background is it was a help when I then moved in, and I've done a lot of teaching in higher education, and that was quite attractive to people who might employ me in a university setting.
Right.
Because students studying a BA in ceramics have to do their studio work, but they also have to write dissertations, and they have specialist tutors for that. But if there's someone who's their studio tutor who can help them think about the relationship between the things.
Well,
that's quite good.
You'd expect someone who has an English and history degree to be able to communicate ideas.
So it was. I think it's been useful to me in that context, and in terms of engaging with the history of ceramics, I think also through teaching, talking to students. Teaching is a wonderfully interesting and rewarding thing. I do much less now, and to some extent I miss it because it's the best of it is really interesting interaction, particularly one-to-one tutorial teaching I really, really like. And I do still do some of that privately, and I do occasionally do some, but hardly at all now in higher education.
Yeah.
But also, taking students to museums and trips to Stoke-on-Trent to look at factories and go to a potteries museum and look at pots. So that every time you see something new and you think about it, and
you might be looking at the same thing, but the students you're with will respond to it in a different way. So the process of teaching is also the process of educating yourself. So it's not a one-way traffic teaching. Yeah, no.
I mean, most of the time also in tutorial teaching, you're talking to a student, you think, I'm actually really talking to myself here, and I should probably do what I say as well.
But so I find that interesting because then you said that basically teaching had always been a thread throughout your career. But I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong in thinking that, but you so you've moved into this gallery which also has a shop front, and so you're maybe sort of more connected to members of the public potentially. Do you feel like that's coincided with you stepping away from teaching because you still have a way of interacting with others, but in a new way?
Yeah, it has. Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, having this space became, you know, it's an old shop, and before I had it was a gallery, and I was quite uncomfortable. You know, I was absolutely terrified when I first took it on, partly because it was a big financial commitment, and it was about 3 times the size of my previous studio. But it's been a wonderful space for me, and partly because, you know, part of what my work is about is light and space, this brought-in work, and to have somewhere which is spacious and light really helps you with making that. And so I've been able in this space to make things that I probably couldn't have imagined. I mean, the first significantly tall column piece I made in my previous studio, and in order to be able to really look at it, I had to put it on one side of the room, open the door and go outside and look at it from outside in to get far enough away from it to be able to understand it. And so and that was quite small relative to some of the things I've made now, so I couldn't really literally have conceived of them, let alone had the space to make them in that space. Right. But what you were talking about the sort of public facing aspect to this, I've been sort of slightly shy of engaging with, because really I wanted a studio space to make things in. This space happened to become available in the village where I was living anyway, and had been empty for a couple of years. And so I've got a sort of an accidental shop front, which it does enable me to put some things in the window, and sometimes people see those and knock on the door or come in, and sometimes they even buy them. And so it has, and I do open my studio sort of more formally every now and then. Yeah. So it's and that's lovely actually, that I get people in, and I love to, and it gives me, this space has given me the space, as we can see, probably to display things in a gallery-like setting, which helps me look at my own work and understand my own work, but also is very useful as a sort of showroom in a sense. And so galleries that I work with, I always try and get the gallerist to come to my studio so that they can, that's interesting to them to see how and where things are made, but it's also about they can see how things work in space.
Yeah, they can imagine how they might display it in their own gallery, exactly. And so how it might work in relation to everything else. Yeah. And so, okay, so you said the space has affected what you make. I guess, do you work to commission at all?
I have done a bit. I mean, I have, not an awful lot. It tends to be, I mean, I have, with the lathe turn work, which is what I've been, as we said, doing mostly for the last 10 or 12 years, and is what I'm sort of most known for, and it's the biggest output I've ever had, because I've been doing less and less other things, teaching and having young children and so on alongside it. And so I do some commissions which tend to be, can you make me one like that, but in that colour, that size or something. I mean, I had a commission last year that came through Cavaliero Finn Gallery, which was that, and this is quite interesting, commissions in my experience tend to be based around scale. So, this commission came from came to the gallery from an interior designer who wanted something that was 80 centimetres by 40 centimetres.
Okay, so very specific.
So it's like, we want something for this space. Okay. We like the aesthetic of Nicholas's work, and it fits in with the whole concept for this interior scheme we're doing for someone. Could he make something like that? Now, I'd previously made for Cavaliero Finn a diptych, 2 cylinders with these internal forms, different conical forms, which is a thing that one of these things that shifts as you move around it. That was conveniently 40 centimetres by 20 centimetres, so it was half the linear dimensions.
Right.
So it meant that we could send them photographs of that with some different dimensions on and go, it'll look like this. I then had the challenge of making that piece twice as big, which was which was heinously difficult because
I can imagine.
there's a massive difference between linear dimension and volumetric dimension.
Yeah.
But
And just the weight of it must have been...
Yeah, it was pretty chunky. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember the weight, but each cylinder ended up weighing 20 kilos or something like that.
Right. Yeah, so even just moving it around and stuff like that already is a difference.
Yeah, so and it was just pushing actually the edge of what I could throw and get on the lathe, and it was pushing the edge of the process, but it worked. So, but that's an example. So it was like, what was quite exciting about it is it pushed me to a different scale. And there's a piece in the window actually. It's about the same scale that I made afterwards. I made it in a slightly easier way because I'd learned. So, yeah, I mean, a commission can be great. Well, the really nice thing about it is that you're making, and you know, it took a lot of time. There was a lot of effort. It was hours and hours and hours and hours at the lathe. And as you're doing it, you're thinking, I know I'm going to be paid for this time. So that's whereas most of the making I do is on some level is to demand, in that it's for a particular gallery, for a particular exhibition, for an art fair or something. Behind us is a piece I've just finished. The colour blend piece there is for Collect, and I've just literally just finished that last week. But that's sort of commission or suggested, part of a discussion with the gallery to say, what about making something like this that's an adaptation of something you've made for us before? So it's not purely speculative making, but I don't know I'm going to get paid for it until they sell it.
Yes. Okay. so is there anything that you make that is completely speculative?
I suppose the things that, well, I suppose when you're making new work that you don't know you've got a market for, that's more speculative. So these fluxworks have been shown a bit and sold a bit, and you learn, when you're making new work, you make a new body of work, you tend to make a various different manifestations of that set of ideas, and some of them sell better than others. So it becomes focused in, because inevitably if you make three things and one sells, then when you're making the next three things, you remake the one that sold.
Yes.
It's logical.
It makes sense. What about...
So there's very, when you're making something, you don't know if there's a market for it. And it's just like to do with making something that interests you, and you hope that if it interests you, it's going to interest someone else, and you hope that it's kind of got a sort of validity in the world, then that's purely speculative.
What about your relationship to museums? Because you've talked about, and gallery owners coming in here, and you're clearly to some level documenting your career in different stages of it. Is that, do you have work in museums? Is that something?
Yeah, I've got work in a number of museums. I mean, and those have come through a variety of different routes, but I mean, in this country, the Fitzwilliam Museum, York Museum, and the V&A acquired a piece last year, and some museums abroad as well, in Italy and Germany and New Zealand. So, I mean, that's getting work into museums is fantastic as a kind of accreditation of what you're doing, and kind of validation and a sort of pat on the back. It's also fantastic because it helps people want to buy things.
Yeah, true.
So it enhances reputation. It's interesting. So we've got representatives from the pieces, and that's likely, to some extent, I accidentally still own these. So I haven't been very conscious of keeping things throughout my career that I, wanted. Identifying things and thinking I'll keep that. And I was talking to you earlier about when I was an undergraduate and writing my dissertation. I was lucky enough to go and spend an evening talking with and interviewing Elizabeth Fritsch.
Yeah.
And was absolutely sort of gobsmacked when she told me that she kept half of everything that she made, which wasn't very many things anyway, in order to be able to lend them to museums and exhibitions.
It's so incredibly deliberate, isn't it? And
it's brilliant. Yeah. It's genius. And what I didn't do is take that on board and act on it until recently. And what I have done in the last few years, there's a couple of things that I've thought I'm keeping that one. And actually, there's a piece that last year. Well, in fact, the acquisition from the V&A, Alan Graves from the V&A the curator came to the studio, linked with a solo exhibition I had in the museum in Petersfield, and we were discussing the piece that was in that exhibition that was an orbit and was on the cover of the catalogue, and I was saying to Alan, we had exactly this conversation. I was saying, I've decided to keep that one, and he said, oh, bother, I was hoping we could buy it. And I said, well, that's different.
Yeah.
That's another way.
I guess it's different because it's one thing for it to sort of disappear into a private collection, and then it might get sold on. You never know where it is, or it might get damaged or whatever it is, right? Yeah. Versus it goes into a public collection, and that's
I mean, the thing is, you want things to go somewhere because it literally. Well, if a thing goes somewhere, it means you've probably earned some money, so you've got the ability to carry on living and make the next thing. But literally, it also gives you the space to make things. There's also a risk for makers that you can end up surrounded by the second best things you've made, or even the third and fourth best as well. Because if you make a number of pieces and they go off to an exhibition, then on the whole, what you think and everyone else thinks are the best pieces are going to go, and then the other ones come back. And I mean, there's an interesting thing about that, which is over time, I've come to know and love some things I've made more over time and understand them, and not really even get what might have been good about them when I first made them. So a couple of times I've been quite glad that's happened.
Yeah.
But no, it's a very interesting. I mean, I have been to old friends' houses, and I remember once going in and thinking, and seeing something I'd given them. I think as a wedding present years ago. I was like, oh my God, did I make that? It was like, that's quite good, wasn't it?
And that's really lovely.
And it was lovely, so I mean, they're still a friend, so I can still go and see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's a sort of dream commission that you would like to get, or maybe it's something that you want to make next?
I think, well, the things I want to make next, I think the dream commission is to do with space, is to be, I mean, I'm increasingly wanting to engage with bigger scale. I mean, the tallest thing I've made the biggest thing is a 2.5 metre tall column, and it's slightly a homage to Brancusi's endless column, and it's this form that goes in and out and in and out as it goes up and down, but the inside is doing the opposite to the outside.
Right.
You will have seen it at Chelsea Harbour, actually,
yes,
that tall column,
yes, because we should say you took part in Future Heritage, which is
where you saw my
curated
work,
by Corinne Julius. So where I came across your work.
And that column was displayed there, actually. So, but the dream commission, in a sense, is to make something for a particular space. So, because the work is sort of about this interaction with space and with body in space and light, then I'd love to, at some point when someone's building, to work with an architect or someone's building something, to make something that is part of the original concept of this architectural space that deals with something sort of liminal, so some sort of transitional space, a place where people move around, or maybe is like looked through from one space to another. That's a bit sort of nebulous, but that's the sort of dream, is to be able to get in. I suppose it's to sort of make it an architectural interaction, actually. Yeah,
because I was going to say, actually, did you get, when you had that commission from the interior designer, did you get much information about the project so you could see? No, it was very much...
I've never seen a picture of it in situ. I've no idea what the rest of it... I don't even...
So you want something like that, but more collaborative, basically?
Yeah, I think so, where I get to, look at, be in at the conception of a space to make something that interacts with it. Yeah, would be... And the other thing, I mean, I'd like to work on bigger scale. I mean,
what I'm imagining if you had like a spiral staircase and then you made like a central...
Yeah, it'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Yeah,
that would be
next
really
to a staircase, or, that's...
And if you had like, sorry, I'm imagining a new space now, but if you had like skylights and then you're, going through a spiral staircase around it, and you had sort of the light changing around the day and, shadows being cast on the wall, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
Sorry,
there's also, you know,
running away with the idea
because they're
now.
good with shadows. Look, you see. Mm-hmm. There's some fun with shadows.
Yeah.
So I suppose, and I'd like these. There's some limitations in some of the forms I make to do with the scale of how they're made.
Yeah.
So literally how big a thing I can put on a lathe. These orbit forms, which are the most successful things I've ever made, and I really find them very interesting and engaging. And I would like to make them much bigger, but I can't on a lathe. So making those bigger involves probably shifting material, probably shifting process entirely, and getting something cast or something made in another way, and that'd be quite interesting to me, because I'd love to know what it looked like if it was
bigger,
much bigger.
Yeah.
It shifts into a different realm, but that is kind of an ambition at the moment. The things like that column and the diptych that I was talking about deals with scale in a different way, and actually deals with scale in a very ceramic way, which is by building with bricks, effectively. So it's making multiple components which are assembled into a piece. Just the nature of these things means that they have to be an entire form, so it's more limited in scale by the process. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that hasn't come up in conversation that you'd like to sort of share about your work? Or
I suppose one thing is that we referred to sort of drawing a bit earlier, but that's become an increasingly important part of my practice. And I make and exhibit ink and water drawings as well. I love to try and find opportunities to show those alongside ceramics, and there are some here in the studio. And they are a sort of parallel activity and a different way of thinking about the same set of ideas. And I think that sort of really developed for me when I was doing this research project at the Royal College. And when I'd first lathe turned something, and I said earlier, I'd done this and I thought that's quite interesting, but maybe it was a bit too simple. I had this notion that I could take this skeletal form and immerse it in a kind of semi-opaque or translucent glaze, and that would be quite an interesting thing to do. And in order to visualize that idea, I started doing these drawings with areas of wet and dry marks and wet marks, and using water and ink on paper to visualize that. Now that then became a parallel activity, because actually what the water does on paper and moving ink and blurring marks it's like a stand-in for what happens with the relationship of movement around a form in understanding these objects. So it's like what happens with the body, or with the viewpoint moving around. So it helps me think about that. And it is weirdly what led to these. So that interaction between the wet and dry paper is actually where this work is rooted. So it kind of went from trying to visualize something about that moves right so that there's a sort of bounce here of drawing helping me get from here to here.
Right.
And the other thing is that in coloring these pieces, when I first made the lathe turn pieces, they were all completely monochrome. The project had been about light and space and shadow, light and shadow, and it was a kind of very rigorous research project. Martin Smith, who was the head of the department at that time, amazing artist, was my supervisor, and he's a he's a bit of a minimalist, and so am I to some extent, but he's a very, very rigorous thinker. And so
I was going to say it's all about precision, isn't it?
It's all about precision, but precision of thinking and of questioning. What's the question? What's the question? And so honing it down. So strip away the variables. So you're dealing with form and light and shadow. You don't need colour in there as well, because it's another thing to confuse you. So I worked monochrome for years, and then I wanted to introduce colour more into this work.
And we see it behind us. Yeah. You've got.
And so now
you'll have this sort of same shape, but with graduations of colour.
Yeah. So that's something I'm working with more and more with colour, but the how I do it was inspired by making the drawings. Okay. So I was wanting to colour this, and I was thinking about how to colour it, and how to have some of that quality of what happens with light and the indeterminacy of the form and what happens with movement, and that was what's happening in the drawings. So the notion of using soluble metal colorants, which is very unusual in ceramics, occurred to me because I've been making these drawings. So they've become very tied up together, and the activity of drawing and making images in different ways and using different processes informs what I do with these. And now I'm doing something which is sort of unusual, and it involves, again, water, saturation and evaporation as a way of moving colour through the form. The colour starts on the inside and through a process goes to the outside of the form, which is conceptually quite interesting when I'm talking about this space, internal and external space. And it involves a bit of chemistry, and so what the colour blend you can see behind you is a sort of transition from iron to cobalt, and is a kind of, you know, I've had to remember some O-level chemistry and tap into my daughter's A-level chemistry a bit to understand this.
Well, that's what I love about ceramics. I think it's because it is an incredibly technical.
Yeah, and I think that's,
craft.
What we were talking about earlier about skill and so on, and, and all that sort of engagement with how things are made, So this notion of how I colour things, I'm able to do it because I've been making ceramics for years, and I can go, I remember years ago there was that, I've seen once or twice, and there's one book written on the subject, and I've managed to get hold of a copy of that and learn a bit about it, and there's not much out there about it, and there's very few artists using this process, and I've innovated a new way of using it that's kind of mine, and it's it's really exciting. It brings back the surprise, because I can do these things, and it's like, what happens if, which is always what you want. What happens if I do a kind of a line blend, which is a classic way of testing things in ceramics, between two metals, and I do it in this kind of very composed and ordered way. What are the colours in the middle? And then you get a transition like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that also refers very consciously to a shift from land to sea. So it's the sort of colour of earth and to the colour of water. And there's something which has been a sort of underlying inspiration to me, is a particular bit of coastline in Scotland, which I've visited every year of my life since I was 5 weeks old.
Oh, wow.
And that, I think that's very, is very important to me. And there's something about the fact of the consistency of looking at the same place again and again and again and again, and realising that it's never the same twice, because the light is different, the tide, and it's a liminal space as well. So it's got that sense of tide, and with these pieces and the kind of movement that happens as you move around it, and the fact that it seems to breathe, and the fact that it's a globe, is partly thinking about the tide and what the water's doing on the earth.
That makes so much sense, yeah.
And so that sense of a space where literally the form is changing. There's an interaction between land and sea, and between light and also time, because you change over time. So it's never the same twice. And that's partly what I'm trying to, I think this, to some extent, is an abstract manifestation of my experience of that. And that's making it a bit more conscious, because there's something about that colour on the left. It's actually very like bladderwrack seaweed against blue water, but it's about that kind of shore space. So that piece is called Shoreline, as a reference to that.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for, sharing your journey, and, it's a lot of exploration and keeping yourself really engaged and evolving through this medium. So it's, really inspiring.
That's a pleasure. It's been interesting. It's always nice to talk about it as well as do it.
I've linked Nick's website below, and I'm hoping that a project will come his way that enables him to collaborate with an architect and really push the boundaries of his craft even further. Thank you for watching. It means a lot, especially as at the moment this channel is entirely self-funded. So please spread the word. Like, comment, share and subscribe. See you next week.
At some point I decided to not professionally called, right, my name is Nick, because it just felt, there was a formality to Nicholas that I just sort of embraced.
Okay, so
Although,
do you want
when
me...
people call me Nicholas, it slightly feels like my mother's telling me off still. So I don't mind, Nick is fine. Yeah.
Okay.